What if you could have that guts, that bravery inside to get yourself and your life to the next level? Hi, this is Dr. Friedemann, and you're watching Empowerment Solutions. Hi, Leah. So nice to have you on Empowerment Solutions.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that we're connecting.
Well, me too. Me too. And I have to say, I got the book just today, but it is really wonderful when you read a book and it feels like poetry and very important information at the same time. So it's like has a
Mhm.
certain kind of rhythm and music to it. And yeah, it just was just a joy to delve into it. But I have a question about,
Uh-huh.
the title and of course why you wrote it. I think you and I are people that write books because there is something personal about them. There is
Yeah.
something that we really want to share with
Yes.
others. So why is that book so personal for you? Gutsy, being brave ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, I thank you for delving right in. And thank you for the compliment. That means a lot, when you write a book and it's out there and it's just nice to hear how it's landing on people. And Gutsy, the story of Gutsy, I think was something that I had wanted to write for a long time. So I'd always sort of had this idea of writing a book like this for a while because it felt like such an important thing to share with the world, just sort of including, from as a psychologist, from like my psychology background and clinical stories, but also from my own personal story of how we can all be brave and learn to pay attention to what's keeping us stuck and then get unstuck. And so I think it was just the collision of me having had my own personal experiences and my personal journey. I talk about that a little bit in the book through mindfulness and how that really opened me up and helped me gain some self-awareness as to how unhappy I was in certain ways in my life and how I could step into this braver, lighter life. So wanting to share that that's possible with other people, just because for me, it hadn't felt possible for a long time. It just was something that like, I felt like I was in this system and I felt like this was the way that my life was going to be. And it wasn't bad, but it was just sort of, it was really, really transformative, my mindfulness. So I want to share that with the world. And then also just noticing like the collision of that with my clinical work and seeing that other people are going through very similar processes in their own lives.
Yeah, and something that I found so interesting about when I heard about your book, it was mindfulness as, kind of the umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was really a mindfulness book. I think it was more a
Mm-hmm.
book from you writing
Mm-hmm.
about the wisdom that you have gained over the years. So if anyone hears
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness and said, I read about 10 mindfulness books, so skip this one, definitely not, because it's very different. It's
Yeah.
much more, I would say it's not about the practice of mindfulness. It's much more about, it was the magic and the wisdom that comes with it and that comes through you. So it's definitely a different book than just a mindfulness book.
Yeah. And thanks for naming that so well, because that was my intention, because there are so many amazing mindfulness books out there that can help us learn the practice of mindfulness and understand what exactly it is and get at the research behind why it's helpful for us. And like what you said in the very beginning, when I set out to write this book, I wanted to make it personal, how mindfulness has touched my life and how universal that experience can be, so this is how it impacted my own personal life with the specifics of the context of my life. But we can take those lessons and those ideas and that wisdom that really does come from, I think, the practice of being still and noticing what's going on inside of us and recognizing and shifting our relationship to it to access this more meaningful life. Yeah.
And that's, what you said about stuckness as a starting point. Why do
Uh-huh.
you think being brave is so important when we want to get out of this stagnation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need it's the other side of the coin, So the first side of the coin is self-awareness, it's this idea of what's happening for me, how am I feeling in my life? Am I feeling stuck? Are there things that I'm yearning to do and I'm not doing? So once we have that self-awareness, that's just the first step. It's a big step, but it's the first step. It's not going to take us anywhere. And being brave is the other side of that coin. So it's okay, how can I take what I've discovered about myself and make meaningful change in my life. And I think that for most of us, that requires an element of bravery to varying degrees. I mean, I think especially depending on what we're talking about, but oftentimes the reason why we're stuck, or the reason why we haven't done the thing, or why we're still in a system that's not working, is because we're scared. I talk about that too. It's the fear that's holding us back, even if it's not super conscious. So it's just this idea of keeping the status quo. And like I was saying before, like things aren't that bad. And so it really, I think, does take an element of bravery to shake things up.
I mean, you talk about the stories that we are nicely building around us, and especially those stories that keep us in the familiar comfort zone, no matter how actually uncomfortable it gets. But, when you say brave and gutsy, a lot of people would say, well, that's not me. That's, it's someone else. I'm too old. I'm too weak. I'm too whatever. How would you make being brave accessible to everyone? Because it's obviously something we all have inside of us, but we don't believe it.
Right. Yeah. And that was also part of the foundation of this book. It's that bravery isn't and doesn't, it can be those big movements and changes and really shaking things up, but it's also in the very small moments, so it's learning to speak up more for yourself if somebody's wronged you or you're feeling hurt, and you've been taught or you've been reinforced that it's good to be quiet and good to sort of make people around you happy at the sacrifice of your own happiness and your own needs. So being brave can be speaking up and saying something like, hey, like that hurt me. Can we talk about that? Being brave can be, the small things that come up at work, if there's something that you really want to do, or you feel like a boundary's been crossed because you've repeatedly asked for this assignment not to be given to you. And then it's saying, this doesn't, we discussed this doesn't work for me. So bravery is in those small moments. And then when we really like make that shift with how we relate to bravery, those small moments build, so it's this small moment and it's that small moment, and it's how I parent my child, and it's how I show up for my partner if I'm in a relationship. And that becomes a different way of life. It's a more empowered, confident, and hopefully fulfilling way of life.
So it's about being, on the one hand, your advocate, advocating for yourself and what you need. And on the other hand, also being more authentic. Because a lot of times we live in a more toned down version of ourselves. And I remember when I was a resident in cardiology, how I was at one point on a Friday night brave to just ask my boss, which literally everyone admired as the half god in white. I mean, there was, barely anyone daring to talk to him. And he came to my ward, and I just asked him if he actually, is stressed, or if, he puts a lot on his plate and how he deals with it. So we had a really just normal human being to human being conversation. And that changed completely our relationship, because I think also that me being authentic made him more authentic. And since ever then, we had actually really some kind of no more this hierarchy that happened. So bravery can also just be authenticity.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's such a beautiful story, because I think that's something that's so relatable to all of us, that there's someone in our lives, or, that we're not bringing our most authentic self to the picture, and without even realizing it. And that creates barriers. And I think that there is tremendous bravery in practicing authenticity, and tremendous rewards, like what, your story.
So what was one of the bravest things you did in your life?
Yeah. Wow. That's a good question. And I talk about this, I try to not make my book about my own story, but to include it just because it felt meaningful. And that was where this
definitely is
came from. So I think something for me that stands out as a brave choice is growing up. I grew up in New York, and I was the youngest of a large family in a system, in a very religious world that is beautiful in many ways and works for many people, and me noticing that it wasn't working for me, and so learning to, in my early 20s, learning to attend to that, like the dissatisfaction or feeling like I was in the system, and doing rituals that felt, that weren't leading me towards a more meaningful path in my own life, and really allowing myself to take a step back and reevaluate and make changes for myself, so to learn to find spirituality and, I guess spirituality and connection in my own way that felt meaningful. And so that was hard to do, because a lot of times when you're in these systems and there's a cultural there's the cultural pressures and the family pressures, in the very beginning too. It's easier to keep the status quo, especially it's not terrible. I think sometimes like we grab, like if it's really, really bad, we might find it easier to be brave, or if it's really, really good, then we feel really content. But what do we do with like the shades of gray, like when we're in the middle and there's things that are working, but we're also not feeling really meaning in a lot of what we're doing. And I think that the nuance becomes harder to meet ourselves in and to find ourselves and to find wisdom and to be brave. And so for me, it was sorting through what I grew up with religiously and then reclaiming my own spiritual practice and making a lot of changes, which was hard to do and felt brave to do.
I really loved in your book the story where you got permission to not have to cover your hair entirely and how that made
Yeah.
a big difference for you. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if this, having to have permission is also something that sometimes we have to look for, maybe giving it ourselves, maybe hearing from other people who did it as well that we can model after, maybe reading your book. I mean, there seems to be something that holds us back from
Yeah.
saying yes. And
Yeah.
what suggestions do you have?
Yeah, I think that is the power of community and social support and role models is that, and when I use the word permission, it wasn't that someone had told me you are allowed to do this. And then I said, okay, now I'm allowed to do this. It was recognizing that there was a different way, and I think that sometimes, and depending on the context of each specific person, depending on what we're talking about with being brave, we're in a system or we're doing the thing, or it could even be like career choice, right? Like your family's always, all the people in your family have gone to this kind of school, doctors, lawyers, and like that's the pressure and that's what you feel like you need to be. And then you meet someone who's done something different and you realize like, oh, there could be a different way for me. And so permission, I think, is really an openness. Like it's an openness to explore, and it's an openness. I think it's like a permission to get out of our own way. Like that's sort of how I used it. And that's how I embrace the different way of life for myself. Like this idea of like, I don't have to stay in my head and unhappy in my head with my thoughts about how I'm living my life. I can give myself permission to notice those thoughts. Again, that's like the mindfulness piece, set them aside and explore a different way of life. Like we've got this one life to live and it's ours. And we get to make choices about how we live it. And I think that that's a very powerful thing that we can all learn from and do.
And do you feel like that in order to really go for it, that we have to also have self-acceptance? I mean, your clientele, my clientele, I think there is a growing sense of not being good enough, a growing comparison and competition with, total strangers that are somehow out there or either on social media or, whatever in the media, where we're just in general feeling, well, we can never measure up. I mean, in your book, you talk about perfectionism and that can also be a root for anxiety. How do we gain more self-acceptance? How can we disconnect from all these outer influences that seem to always repeat the same message? You need to be different, or you need to be the way we want you to be, especially women, but men too. And, it starts very young. I'm really feeling often so empathetic for, the teenagers and earlier that are just so drilled into having to be and conform and excel. How do you just really resolve that inside of yourself and gain more self-acceptance?
Self-acceptance. I mean, I think the way that I think about it is learning to be brave and access more meaning in our life. It's kind of like a pizza pie, so there's different slices of the pie that we need to be, or that we can use to help us be brave. And self-acceptance is like a big piece of that pie. I think that if we are struggling with self-acceptance, I think that's going to confuse us as to what we truly want. And that's, I talk about that, finding our inner wisdom. And part of finding inner wisdom is finding like really, really, really holding on to our self-worth, that's something untouchable, that's something that nothing and no one could impact and never has. And I think what happens, unfortunately, for a lot of people is somewhere along the way, our self-worth, it feels like it's diminished, or because of messages we've got and because of experiences we've had, and that can sort of like confuse us and make us feel like, okay, well, lead us to other ways of being that aren't leading us towards that path of fulfillment. So I'm overcompensating, or I'm trying to because I'm feeling like there's something unworthy about me, I'm getting myself into relationships with people who reinforce that, or I feel like the other, or I feel like I have to overcompensate and become a perfectionist and like really prove my self-worth, because inside I'm feeling unworthy. And so if we're able to sort of separate that out and really get at the self-worth piece and really hone in on that. And all this said, like the book, I hope, can be a good resource for that, but so can therapy, in terms, if that's something that's accessible for people who are listening, in terms of self-exploration and understanding where the shaky self-worth comes from and how to build greater self-worth. That I think that's like one of the pillars, if we're thinking about pillars of finding meaning, that is a pillar.
And, when it comes to self-worth, do you talk about self-worth that, you base on your accomplishments, or do you base it on your innate self-worth, your gifts and qualities inside?
Yeah, so when I use self-worth and I differentiate it from self-esteem, like self-esteem is like, and that's important too. Again, it's a pizza pie, right? So being connected to values and doing things that give us a sense of purpose and that we feel like we're successful at is an important piece of self-esteem and confidence, but self-esteem comes from the external things, oh, I'm pursuing this education that makes me feel good, or this job, or these hobbies, and I feel good about myself because of that. And that's important, but that's not self-worth. Self-worth is this idea of I am inherently a good person who is deserving of a certain kind of treatment from the people around me. So getting in relationships with people who want to hear my feelings, who validate my, like my needs and my emotions are important. And so self-worth is like this internal sense of I'm good. I'm good just as I am. And sometimes people get confused with that, because then people feel like, oh, well, that means that you don't have work to do on yourself. And, and that's not what we're talking about either. Actually, when we really hold on to our self-worth and we really feel like we are inherently good, it makes it easier to do our own work. I mean, we've all got things that we need to work on, but if that's coming from this like strong foundation of like, but I believe I'm inherently a good person and I'm okay and I don't need other people's approval, it's easier for me to take a look in the mirror and say, and I also need to work on this thing, like maybe for someone like anger, I really need to work on my reactivity and with my kids or my partner or whoever, so it's easier to really own that and get out of our egos, I think, when we embrace that internal sense of goodness.
Yeah, and you did it beautiful in the book. You had these questions that you asked readers to ask themselves about self-acceptance. And I'm just going to read them. Can I take myself as I am in this very moment with all that I am, with my strengths, my challenges, my weaknesses, and my fears? Can I allow them just to just be and withhold judgment? Can I allow my humanity just to exist? I just think it's a beautiful way to remind yourself that it is really about the core of who we are, and all those other layers, they are our responsibility. We can choose when and how to address them, but that the core, the self-acceptance, is our birthright. It's one of the greatest challenges, certainly, but it's certainly also our birthright. And I always think about babies that still haven't forgotten how to accept themselves, because they're just crying and screaming and pooping and whatever, and they just accept themselves, and then somehow we forget. Somehow we are told it's not okay anymore to accept ourselves. And I think, you have children, so how do you help your children to remain in that place of self-acceptance?
Yeah, as I heard you talk about kids and how we lose it along the way, I had that thought, and we'll see what my kids say when they're all grown, but it's sort of this idea of really trying to model. So I think it's modeling to them what it looks like, to embrace as a parent, my self-worth, that like pursuing things that are interesting to me, or going with friends, or like just they see that I have things that make me feel happy and good, and and prioritizing sort of that self-care, me time. And it's also how I like, just the messages that I hope that they're getting from me, and reinforcing that, I tell them outright, like, you're amazing, you're magical, like you are inherently worthy. And I don't know, I know growing up, I didn't get those messages, and maybe some people did, and they know to pass that on to their kids. I didn't necessarily get that. And so I feel like that's a big part of it, just letting them know that. And I think what you're saying too, like practicing like openness and authenticity at home with our kids, so when I mess up, or when, like, it's just, it's owning it, it's talking about it. I'm really, really sorry for doing that. How did that make you feel? So really making space for their experience of things and their feelings, and providing a lot of empathy for that. And I think that that's how we, it doesn't sound like it's like, this direct relationship to self-worth, but it is, like when we grow up feeling like our feelings are important and we are important and we're allowed to have different experiences than our parents or feel differently about things, we feel like we're a worthy person. We're like, I'm my own person, and and my feelings deserve respect.
And I think this would probably, have a huge impact on our whole planet if we all would really raise our kids like that. But I think we just have to have more reminders like yourself that this is really the most important thing we can do for our kids, not the extracurricular activities, not when they're in the kindergarten already think about how they get in college, really just working on that foundational piece of accepting themselves, because life is hard enough. The challenges
Yeah.
are big enough. If we
Yeah.
are really not feeling that solidity inside, I think those challenges can easily just become overwhelming and too much.
Yeah. 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 100%. And as you're talking, I'm thinking too, like, wouldn't that be cool if that's something that we can all learn to bring to the relationships with the people that we have around us on small levels and big levels? This idea of curiosity, authenticity, knowing that we're entitled, like we all have our own perspective on things and our own opinion, and it's okay for other, and not only is it okay, people will see the world in a different kind of way than me, and making space for that, like
Right.
I think that would, gosh, that would be such a cool thing to start to see a shift in our world, because there's so much contempt.
Well, I think the world needs a shift, and maybe that's
Yeah.
exactly the shift it needs, away from, this just feeling more separate from each other, feeling more focusing on what is actually not working with ourselves or with others, to really
Mhm.
going to acceptance. Because I think personally, when you accept yourself, it's much easier to accept others. And
Yeah.
because there is a certain sense of kindness and compassion also with your flaws. And speaking of kindness, that was really interesting about in your book too, that you said for life, it's really important to find a balance between a word a lot of people don't like, which is
Hmm.
discipline,
Hmm.
and kindness.
Yep.
And I thought, I really believe in discipline as being the disciple of yourself, being the servant of yourself. But it was really nice how you laid it out. So, what would you say is the balance that really needs to be found in this regard?
Yeah. And so it's the discipline kindness equation is something that runs through my mind a lot, actually. Like, what is the choice that I'm doing kind, or is it in the name of discipline to get me to do the thing that I need to do? And I really feel like to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish, whether it's professionally or in our personal lives, we need to find that balance. And that balance is subjective for each person and depending on what we're talking about within that person. But really what it means is to get things done, or even like what we were saying before, to take accountability as a parent, to do our own work, we need discipline, reading books, going for therapy for ourselves if we feel like we need that to process old stuff that we're coming into parenthood with, so the discipline to show up and do hard work balanced with kindness. So that means making sure that our discipline and that approach doesn't become rigidity and harshness, where it's I'm berating, I didn't do it the way that I wanted to, or I didn't show up this one time. And so now I'm talking, really negatively about myself, or feel really, really bad about myself, like I'm a bad person. That's where we move into like harshness and sort of like this cruel way of being with ourselves. So kindness is, how do we meet ourselves when we make mistakes, when we don't show up? And also making sure that like we're not being like these relentless soldiers, like push, 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 like now it's time to take a break, or now I need a little bit of space to myself. Like an example that I put in the book, this is a very small example, but I think it really does paint the picture in terms of what this means, in terms of finding that balance, like I talk about taking the stairs up to my office at work, so there's 4 flights of stairs. And before COVID, I would always try and take the stairs because there was another way of just getting a little bit more movement in my day, because I sit a lot during the day. And that, some days you get up early and it feels like, oh, I don't want to I want to just take the elevator. But to me, discipline felt like, no, this is good. My body wants to move. I'm going to be sitting. So I have the discipline to take the stairs. Kindness would be on the mornings when I'm carrying, 5 different bags and a hot cup of coffee in my hand, and that might spill all over me if I'm trying to take the steps. So, okay, today I'm going to take the elevator because that's what I need to do today, or it's really, really hot outside. We were just talking about the heat before, and the staircase is sweltering, and that's just going to be really uncomfortable for my body. So I'm going to take the elevator today. So it's a small example, but I think it does really portray this idea of like, okay, well, where am I at? Where's the discipline and where's the kindness? And I think that line shifts.
But that's really, really an art form for ourselves, because we have been raised, most of us, with this idea that discipline is more something harsh. And so, it's something that also comes with when you don't really have it, you're lazy, or you get punishment or negative outcomes. So seeing discipline as actually really being of service to yourself, and then seeing the kindness also as a way of not letting you just self off the hook, but actually giving something else to yourself. I remember when I had this discipline of every morning, very early, going to the gym. And then I realized, wow, this becomes my own imprisonment. And so laying in bed and checking in and do I really want to go today, and not going, it felt like free. It felt amazing. And so that kind of kindness is also a form of service. Both is a form of service. And when you are, and that's at least personally what I find, when we are using discipline and we're really pushing ourselves beyond this little, we call it in German, the inner swine dog, which I have no idea what it means, but it's just something, this little voice that says, no, don't do it. It's not really so important. Just sit there and have your ice cream. And when you go beyond that with the discipline, with your own commitment, I feel it's so important then afterwards to really congratulate yourself, to be nice to yourself, to appreciate yourself. And that's what I find we didn't get. I was always, best in class, but did I really get the approval for it that I really wanted or hoped for? No.
Yeah.
And so many of us do the same to ourselves.
For sure. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that we focus so much on like the beginning of the process, like getting ourselves to show up and, okay, it's this morning. Yes, I feel like I really do want to go to the gym and it's good for my body. And this is, in the name of discipline and kindness, because you're right, they're linked. I'm going to get myself to go. And then we're done with our workout. And then we just go like, okay, and now I need to do this. And now I need to do that. And we don't like spend enough. And I know speaking from my own personal experience from, the clinical work that I do with clients that I work with, we really don't create enough pauses after we've done the hard thing. And after we, just to even, whether it's something practical, like, so it's a little pick me up. Oh, I'm going to get myself a nice coffee because I just did something hard, or it's just, and I think this is even more powerful sometimes. It's just sitting with that feeling. It's like, oh, I just did something amazing and my body feels great, and go me, that was hard, like just for a brief little moment. And people say, I don't have time, I'm so busy. That's silly. Like, we have enough time to like let the feeling sink in and like notice how light our body feels and what the sense of pride feels in our body. Like, we can all do that. We can all make enough time in our day to access those feelings as well.
And you also, in this regard, write about the not being 110%, but really being 60% rule. That was really fascinating, because I think, this is certainly challenging in a gutsy way other people's perfectionistic belief system. So what would you say, when does that rule apply?
Yeah. And I've gotten a lot of questions about that rule, because it really does challenge the norm of what do you mean? You got to give it your all and then some. And so what do you mean 60%? Like, that sounds like ridiculous. You're not going to get anything done if you give it 60%. And I put this in the book, like, it's not like this general rule of thumb. And I think this is where the self-awareness comes from. Like, we know ourselves, am I using that 60% rule where I only, have to give it 60% to get myself off the hook, or because I just don't feel like doing it, or is it really coming from like this intentional, mindful place of, I don't need to always push myself that hard. Showing up and being present is enough sometimes, with all that pushing. And I think for perfectionists, and I wrote this in my book too, oftentimes the people who are reading self-help books tend to probably follow down that path of like, okay, I got to be better and I want to work on myself. It's this idea of, we can hold things with a little bit of a lighter touch, like let go, it's okay. And I heard that 60% rule from a yoga class. I was taking a mindful yoga class, and a long time ago, when I was actually pregnant with my daughter, which was a long time ago. And the yoga teacher, well, she wasn't, it was a yoga class for everyone. It wasn't like a prenatal yoga class, but she just said to everyone, like, give it 60%. And in that moment, for me personally, because I was in this like, pregnant phase of my life doing a yoga class, and I was a really staunch perfectionist, at the time. I've worked through it a lot since then, but it was just an eye opener, like, oh, my body right now doesn't need to do 110%, in this state that I'm in. And I could celebrate me being here and doing the yoga in the way that feels right for me at a 60% level and feel really good about that. Like not then after and we probably, like, perfectionists can relate to this, after you do the workout, but you let yourself walk some of the time instead of run, you're like, oh, I didn't do such a good job of that one. Tomorrow, hopefully I'll run the whole time, or whatever it is. But just to feel really good about what we did do.
And it's really, for me, the interpretation was also that if you're giving 60% to one area, then you still have 40% to all other areas, and automatically your life becomes more full. I mean, I personally have given 110% to one small aspect of my life, and there was nothing left. And then you wonder why your life is not really as harmonious and balanced as it should be.
For sure. Totally. Yeah. I agree with that too.
So is there anything that you would say that, if you had one advice for people that are really needing the more gutsiness in their life, what would that be? The one thing that you would like them to take away?
I think the one thing that I would like people to take away is this idea of learning, because I think it's something we can all do starting from like this moment and on, to create little pauses for yourself where you check in with yourself and you ask yourself, how am I doing in this moment? The way that I like, how's my body? Where are my thoughts? Where are my emotions? Because that, creating a little bit of stillness and a little bit of pause, hopefully can create more of that self-awareness, and in a very gentle and compassionate way, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm upset about what I find when I check in with myself. It's more like, oh, wow, this is here for me. This is here. And I think that's the start. That's the starting point. This is here. And now what? What am I going to do with that?
That's beautiful. And what would you think would happen if really this would be a movement? If people would read your book, they would take in what you're saying, and this would be like, really something that becomes global. How would the world be different?
I mean, that would be so awesome, and I think that a lot of people are trying to do this. A lot of people are trying to do this work. I mean, a lot of my role models and people that I look up to, people who brought mindfulness over to the Western world, and trying to make it accessible to everyone and more accessible. I think, they're on that mission too, because there's so much beauty in accessing a more mindful, intentional, compassionate life that generalizes to the people around us. And so, I mean, wow, wouldn't that be so amazing and you were saying this before too, like that we can have compassion for other people without self-compassion. But if we have self-compassion, we can have even more compassion, like we're open to like just a more connected, more authentic, a more beautiful life. And so I think that would be like so neat if more and more of us would, do some of this mindfulness work. And
and which is really why working on yourself is always something that will eventually also affect all those around you in a positive way. So there is nothing selfish about it, which I know some people always think, oh, I shouldn't focus so much on myself. That's self-indulgent, but it's ultimately giving back in big ways afterwards or during you're working on yourself. So read the book. So tell people how they can find the book and how they can find you and all the stuff that they need to know.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So the book it's sold wherever major retailers where books are sold, and on Amazon and on Audible. So that's where my book is. And my website's drleahkatz.com. And I'm also on Instagram quite a bit. I post mental health tips almost daily. And that's been a fun endeavor too. Yeah.
And it's really great. I mean, your posts are amazing, and they're always so beautifully written and so just, calmly inspirational. They're not some, in your face, something shock effect. It's like really like you just portray an energy that makes you immediately feel like, I'm seen and understood, which is really kind of amazing how you do that. So I really appreciate your posts and your book and your work. So thank you so much for being in Empowerment Solutions. And I hope we can talk again, because you have so much wisdom to share.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a lovely conversation. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Friedemann here. Thank you for tuning into my YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about fear and anxiety, here you'll find guided meditations, webinars, and interviews with some of the most renowned experts in the field of empowerment. Delve into the over 230 videos and more to come every week.